The week's end top stories at NBR. Explore Technologies will be listed. Entrepreneur and NBR lister Murray Bolton says the country's third largest early childhood education provider has been acquired. When will Tourism Holdings fleet levels return to pre-COVID-19? And there's more coming right up. Kia ora and welcome to NBR This Week. We start with a wrap of the end of the week's top business stories from the authority in New Zealand business news since 1970, nbr.co.nz. Then we'll take a look back at the top NBR Today stories from the past week. I'm Paul Brennan. Thanks so much for joining us. Explore Technologies, the parent company of Murray Bolton-backed Transaction Services Group, will be listed. The question is when, says the entrepreneur and NBR lister. The software services group filed preparatory documents for its initial public offer with the US Securities and Exchange Commission a few weeks ago, and Bolton is due to fly out to Boston for board meetings to discuss it next month. That's why I'm trying to get out of Dodge on the 7th of November for a go, no-go decision on listing. We're well down the track, he said. The only question is when rather than if. Explore was formed from the merger of TSG and Clearant, both controlled by private equity firm Advent International. The group provides business management software for specific sectors, early education, health and fitness, as well as services such as dry cleaners and certain trades, and a payment system acquired via Clearant. Auckland Diagnostics tech firm Picta will be rolling out its COVID-19 antibody test by the end of next month, following registration with MedSafe. Picta Chief Operating Officer Howard Moore said the company's low-cost, high-performance, high-throughput multiplexed COVID-19 test can help determine when antibody levels following vaccination have declined to a level where revaccination is required. New Zealand needs to be aware that achieving very high vaccination levels will simply not be enough in the medium term, Moore told NBR. The Delta variant is relentless, and as jurisdictions overseas have already discovered, revaccinations will be required for many people to keep them, their families, workplaces and communities safe. An Auckland testing laboratory will be offering the Picta test before the end of November. The country's third largest early childhood education provider has been acquired by the Australian arm of a global ECE provider in a deal reportedly worth $160 million. Busy Bees Early Learning Australia yesterday announced the acquisition of New Zealand's provincial education group from majority shareholder Waterman Private Capital, Accentro Capital and its founders Andrew and Katie Phillips. Provincial was founded as a single centre in Rotorua in 2013 and has quickly expanded its national footprint to 75 centres and more than 5,500 places across the North and South Islands. The company claimed to be the third largest ECE provider in New Zealand. Busy Bees Australia and New Zealand Chief Executive Robert Hughes said that since Busy Bees had entered the region in 2018, it had investment in new centre openings and acquisitions across Australia and now New Zealand. Tourism Holdings Chief Executive Grant Webster reckons he's often asked whether the company can return to the fleet levels it had before COVID-19, and if so, when. The first part is easy, he told the tourism operators' annual general meeting yesterday. ANZ and Westpac have committed to about $200 million in lending, which means it had plenty of headroom to buy about 2,500 vehicles. The second part, less easy, Webster went on to say that any prediction today was misleading, but then provided a general guide. We are targeting for the US and Australia to get back to pre-COVID fleet levels at some point in fiscal year 23. The reason Webster was asked this question so often, he said, was because it was a proxy for whether the company could ever get back to its pre-COVID profit levels. An investment by Pencaro Private Equity has brought together two regional clinical trial research companies to bolster their capabilities and target untapped growth in the Asia-Pacific market. Lakeland Clinical Trials, LCT of Rotorua, and Southern Clinical Trials, SCT of Christchurch, have consolidated into one entity that will operate as PCRN Limited, or the Pacific Clinical Research Network. Pencaro holds a 52.4% stake in the new business. LCT founders Philippa Williams and Dr. Michael Williams and SCT's Julia Matheson and Dr. Simon Carson have worked closely for many years but decided their respective businesses' growth had surpassed their individual capacities. Those are our top stories as we head into the long weekend, the full versions of which, along with all our breaking business news columns and opinion, are at nbr.co.nz right now. You're watching NBR This Week, a brief look back now at the week's top stories from our daily business news bulletin, NBR Today. On Monday, interest interest in Vulcan. The long-awaited $1 billion IPO of Vulcan Steel was strongly sought after by New Zealand investors, but more heavily marketed to Australian institutions, fund managers say. There are also questions for some about the stage the business has reached before coming to market, although most describe it as a strong business with an impressive management team. Vulcan Steel was established 25 years ago by Peter Wells and has grown into a business distributing steel products, including carbon, engineering and stainless steel, to a diversified customer base from 29 sites in Australia and New Zealand. Peter Wells joined the NBR's Dita Daboni.
I read a good quote in the Wall Street Journal recently which said, an IPO is like your funeral, you only do it once. And so I think there was a bit of that around it. We were taking advice as we went along, and the suggestions were that 49% was a good number.
It's NBR This Week, the week's top stories from our daily video business news bulletin, NBR Today. From Tuesday, housing détente. The government and the National Party have put partisan politics to one side and agreed on immediate amendments to the Resource Management Act to make it easier to build more houses. New building intensification rules will allow up to 3 homes, up to 3 stories high, to be built on most sites without the need for a resource permit. It's expected this will lead to at least another 48,200 homes being built in the next 5 to 8 years, and possibly as many as 105,500. Joining NBR's political editor, Brent Edwards, was National's housing spokesperson, Nicola Willis.
National has for many years argued that restrictive planning laws and land use restrictions have held back housing development. So we wrote to the government at the beginning of the year and offered to work with them on urgent reforms to address those issues. We've subsequently put forward our own proposals. So we were very pleased when Ministers Woods and Parker wrote to me and said, well, let's actually work together on this. So it's been a few weeks in the making.
This is NBR This Week, the past week's top 5 business stories from NBR Today. From Wednesday, Truffles. Matthew and Catherine Dwan have spent 4 years sniffing out the best piece of land in New Zealand on which to grow truffles. And now they reckon they've found it, they're keen to invite others to the feast, seeking to raise $26 million from long-term wholesale investors. They joined the NBR's Will Mace.
So when we got settled in North Canterbury on our 4-hectare property, we began to be a lot more conscious really of using land with the right type of purpose and in a sustainable manner. And we actually noticed that in some respects, lifestyle properties themselves are a little bit part of that problem. And so that led us to investigate how initially it was actually just to see how we can use our own property in a more sustainable and purpose-driven way. Mm-hmm. So we continue to look at a number of different crops, but truffles in particular continue to outrank almost any other agricultural crop that can be produced in New Zealand.
It's NBR This Week, the top business stories from our daily video news bulletin, NBR Today. From Thursday, UK free trade deal over the line. New Zealand has reached agreement in principle on a free trade deal with the United Kingdom that would give tariff-free entry to 98% of this country's current exports to the UK. In return, all of the UK's exports to New Zealand will be tariff-free. Dairy, meat and horticultural exports were always the sticking points in negotiations between the two countries, but New Zealand appears to have won significant gains. While tariffs will not be removed immediately for these products, extensions to tariff-free quotas will give New Zealand producers more opportunities to sell goods in the British market. This is NBR This Week. Now we're up to Friday's top story. Financial support, largely for struggling Auckland businesses, will double while the city is still locked down. At the same time as announcing increased financial support, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has also unveiled the government's plan to get the country back to work, even as COVID-19 becomes endemic. Ardern has confirmed the government will use a traffic light style framework to determine what level of restrictions should apply in certain areas. But even under red, businesses will still be able to operate. The country will not, however, shift to the new system until the vaccination rate in each district health board area reaches at least 90%. Auckland could move out of lockdown sooner once its 3 DHBs all achieve the 90% milestone. And Ardern said they were only 16,000 jabs away from 90%. having received at least one dose. You've been watching our review of the week's top 5 NBR Today stories. You can find the full versions of those stories and more, along with all our daily breaking business news, columns and opinion at nbr.co.nz right now. Saturday at NBR, in Fact or Fiction, Grant Walker and Brent Edwards on the ramifications of Jacinda Ardern's COVID protection plan, and Neville Gibson's book review, The Unseen Wars of Cyber Terrorism. I'm Paul Brennan. Thanks for watching NBR This Week. Have a great weekend. I look forward to being with you again from Tuesday on NBR Today.